Ida for leaving my mom's house and going to my dad's after fighting with my half-siblings about us not having the same dad? At 16, life feels overwhelming for anyone, but for me, it's a never-ending tug-of-war between two worlds that never truly accept each other. My family situation is complicated, but it's not the kind of complexity I ever asked for. My mom, married to a man who is not my father, seems to live in a delusion where her husband has seamlessly replaced my dad. My siblings, 3 of them, 2 brothers and a sister, all younger than me, are part of this narrative that feels like a noose tightening around my identity. They see their dad as the center of their universe and insist he occupies the same role for me. It doesn't matter that my father has equal custody of me and has been present for every major moment of my life. In their eyes, he's just a guy, an outsider, while their dad is supposed to be mine too. My protests against this forced narrative have always fallen on deaf ears. My mom's justification is as infuriating as it is dismissive. She insists I should be grateful her husband, a man I did not choose, claimed me and gave me the privilege of calling him dad. But I don't want that privilege. I already have a dad, and he doesn't need replacing. The very idea that I should feel indebted to her husband makes my blood boil. The hypocrisy is suffocating. He doesn't want me calling my father dad in his house, yet he demands the same title for himself. Each time I hear it, each time the word is forced out of my mouth, it feels like a betrayal of my real dad, a man who has done nothing but love and support me. It's not just the adults in the household who perpetuate this charade. My siblings, born into the world where my mom and her husband reign supreme, have adopted the same perspective. To them, my situation is just another peculiar family quirk. The fact that I spend every other week with my dad doesn't strike them as unusual, but they've convinced themselves it's not because I have another parent, just someone who's somehow tangentially involved in my life. They've swallowed my mom's narrative whole, parroting back the idea that their dad is our dad, and that my attachment to someone else is an anomaly. The evidence, even when I present it, is met with resistance. One day, desperate to make them see the truth, I dug out old photographs of my dad holding me as a baby. There I was, an infant cradled in his arms, with his face lighting up in the kind of joy only a father can feel. I wanted them to see, to understand that this man wasn't some fleeting presence but a cornerstone of my life. But even then, their reaction was a frustrating mix of denial and indifference. They dismissed the photos as irrelevant, a relic of the past that didn't change the present reality. Their rejection stung more than I expected. It wasn't just about the photos, it was about my right to acknowledge my dad's role in my life, to have my identity respected. Every denial from them, every claim that their dad was mine too, felt like another thread unraveling the delicate balance I was trying to maintain between two homes. It wasn't just their words that got to me, but the conviction behind them, the absolute certainty that I was wrong to feel the way I did. Their dad wasn't mine, not in the way my dad was, and no amount of family dinners, birthday parties, or shared holidays could change that. In moments like these, I found myself questioning my place in their world. I was the odd one out, the interloper who didn't quite belong. My mom and her husband could play house and pretend we were one big happy family, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was the one piece of the puzzle that never fit. My dad, my real dad, was my anchor in all of this chaos. He was the one constant, the one person who never asked me to be someone I wasn't. But even his unwavering support couldn't shield me from the storm brewing on the other side of my life. The anger simmered under the surface, growing stronger with each passing day. It wasn't just about the unfairness of the situation or the constant invalidation of my feelings. It was about the impossibility of reconciling two halves of my life that refused to coexist. My dad's love and my mom's indifference clashed in ways that left me feeling torn apart. Each time I tried to assert myself, to remind them that I wasn't a pawn in their story, I was met with resistance, as if my identity was up for debate. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't something I could ignore anymore. The cracks in the facade were widening, and I knew it was only a matter of time before something gave way. When I was younger, the weight of the confusion and isolation in my life often felt unbearable. I started to internalize the narrative being forced on me by my mom and her husband. Doubts crept into my mind like shadows in the night, whispering questions that left me restless. Was my dad really my dad? Could it be possible that I didn't truly belong to him, and that my mom's husband had some hidden claim over me? It was a toxic, painful spiral that I couldn't escape from. One day, I couldn't keep the questions inside any longer. I asked my dad, trembling with uncertainty, if he was truly my father. The look on his face when I asked that question is something I'll never forget. It was a mix of shock, heartbreak, and determination, as though he knew this was a moment that would define something critical in our relationship. He didn't get angry or defensive. Instead, he sat me down, looked me straight in the eye, and said with unwavering confidence, "Of course, I'm your dad. I've always been, and I'll always be." He reassured me, his voice steady and calm, that there was no doubt in his mind. But even his certainty couldn't completely quiet the storm of doubt that had taken root inside me. The influence of my mom's constant gaslighting and my half-siblings' unrelenting insistence had poisoned my ability to trust my instincts. It wasn't that I didn't believe my dad, I desperately wanted to, but I needed proof to silence the noise in my head. That's when I brought up the idea of a DNA test. I could see the sadness in his eyes as he agreed, but he didn't hesitate. He understood that I needed this, not because I doubted him, but because I needed something irrefutable to ground myself in the truth. We did the test, and when the results came back, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The paper confirmed what I had always wanted to believe. He was my biological father, my real dad, in every sense of the word. But that revelation came with a burden of its own. I couldn't share the results with my mom or her family. I knew my mom would explode if she found out about the test. Her fury would rain down on my dad for agreeing to it, and she'd twist it into another weapon to invalidate him and control me. So, I kept it to myself, a secret locked away in my heart. It was both a relief and a source of frustration, knowing the truth but being unable to use it to defend myself against the constant attacks on my identity. As I got older, the tension at my mom's house only grew worse. Every time my siblings or her husband made a comment undermining my dad or insisting that their dad was mine too, it felt like a fresh wound being torn open. The frustration built inside me like a volcano, bubbling and boiling until I felt like I might erupt. I tried to stay calm, to remind myself that their opinions didn't change the truth, but it was becoming harder and harder to keep my composure. Then came the incident that pushed everything to the brink. It started innocently enough, or as innocently as anything could in that house. My mom's husband was about to turn 40, and my half-siblings wanted to celebrate. They decided that all four of us, me included, should contribute to buying him a gift. They presented the idea to me as though it were a given, as though it were my duty to honor a man I didn't even like. I refused immediately. The idea of spending my money on a gift for him felt like a betrayal of everything I stood for. He wasn't my dad, and I wasn't going to pretend he was for the sake of appearances. My siblings were taken aback by my response, but their surprise quickly turned to anger. They called me selfish, ungrateful, and mean-spirited. They couldn't understand why I wouldn't go along with their plan, and they didn't want to hear my reasons. When I told them flat out that he wasn't my dad and never would be, the situation escalated. They started yelling at me, calling me names and accusing me of being a terrible person. My half-brother, emboldened by his own indignation, went so far as to call me retarded, a word that cut through me like a knife. He said I needed to stop treating our dad like he was some random stranger. It didn't matter how many times I repeated the truth, they refused to listen. My half-sister chimed in, saying they would steal money from me if that's what it took to buy their dad a gift. They claimed he deserved it, that he had earned it, and that my refusal was nothing more than proof of how awful I was. Their words were a relentless barrage, each one chipping away at my resolve. I snapped. The years of frustration, anger, and invalidation boiled over all at once. I told them in no uncertain terms to get out of my face. I said I didn't care about their dad and that he was nothing more than a giant territorial asshole who couldn't accept the fact that my mom had a kid before they met. My voice rose with every word until I was practically shouting, my emotions spilling out in a torrent I couldn't control. I told them I'd rather be an orphan than call their dad mine. The youngest, my 11-year-old sister, burst into tears and ran to her room, but the other two stayed, glaring at me with a mixture of anger and disbelief. They didn't back down, and neither did I eventually. I couldn't take it anymore. I stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind me, and went straight to my dad's place. When I arrived, my dad could tell something was wrong immediately. I was shaking with anger and barely holding back tears. He listened patiently as I recounted everything that had happened, his face a mix of concern and quiet fury. He didn't interrupt or try to minimize what I was feeling. Instead, he helped me calm down, reminding me that I didn't have to face this alone. In the days that followed, I refused to go back to my mom's house. The thought of stepping foot in that place, of facing her husband and my siblings after everything that had happened, was unbearable. My mom didn't take my refusal lightly. She called the police, claiming I was being unreasonable and needed to come home. When the officers spoke to me, I told them plainly that I wouldn't go back willingly. Now, my mom has filed in court, demanding that my dad lose custody of me for allowing me to stay with him instead of forcing me to return to her house. The situation has spiraled out of control, and I feel like I'm caught in the middle of a war I never wanted to fight. Everywhere I turn, I'm met with anger and judgment, and it feels like the walls are closing in. Through it all, one thing remains clear: I won't let anyone erase my dad from my life. No matter what my mom or her husband or anyone else says, I know who my real father is, and I won't let them take that away from me. The tension in the room grew unbearable as my refusal to participate in their plan for their dad's 40th birthday turned into a full-blown argument. My half-siblings, particularly my younger brother and sister, couldn't grasp why I wouldn't just go along with the idea of buying a gift for their dad. They acted as if it was some sort of family obligation, as if it was just what people did, no questions asked. But I couldn't and wouldn't sacrifice my dignity for something that felt so wrong. Their dad wasn't my dad, and no amount of peer pressure, guilt, or manipulation was going to change that. They tried to convince me with arguments that felt as hollow as they were aggressive. "He's our dad," my half-brother yelled. "He deserves something, even if you don't like him." I looked at them, trying to keep my anger in check, but the words they used tied with their smug assumptions were too much. I was tired of pretending that their dad was my dad, tired of the constant reminder that I was the odd one out, that my real father was somehow inferior to the man who had taken my mom's hand. "No, he's not my dad," I snapped. The words left my mouth before I could stop them, raw and forceful. "I don't like him, and I don't owe him anything." They were taken aback by my bluntness, but that didn't stop them. If anything, it only seemed to make them more determined to force me into their mold. My younger sister, not fully understanding the depth of the situation, gave me a look that said she didn't quite grasp why I was being so stubborn. But it wasn't just about the gift, it was about respect, about the continual erosion of my identity. The more I resisted, the angrier they became. "You're such a jerk," my half-brother said, his voice laced with frustration. "He's been so good to you, and you're treating him like trash. You're just a fucking asshole for acting like this." I could feel my face heat up. His words hit harder than they should have. But I couldn't back down now, not when the line had been drawn so clearly in the sand. "I don't care," I said through gritted teeth. "You can't undo the fact that my dad is my dad, in every single way that matters. He's been there for me, and I'll always call him my father. You don't get to erase that." Their attempts at guilt-tripping me were relentless. My half-brother, seething with indignation, spouted out another insult. "Stop treating our dad like he's some random guy. He deserves way better than you're giving him." His words stung, but they also fueled the fire inside me. I was sick of hearing about what their dad deserved. This wasn't about what he deserved. This was about what was right and fair, and what was real. I don't give a crap about what you think he deserves, I snapped back. And I don't care if you think I'm a jerk. But you're not going to make me pretend he's my dad. The youngest one, my little sister, was clearly overwhelmed. Her face twisted with confusion, and I could see the tears beginning to form in her eyes. She retreated to her room, away from the confrontation, and I could feel a pang of guilt, but I had no intention of backing down. But my half-brother wasn't finished. He moved closer, his voice lowering to a threatening tone. If you won't give him something, we'll just take it from you. You think you can just sit there and say no? We'll steal it from you if we have to. We'll take whatever we need from you, so don't think you can get away with this. His words were a sickening mix of rage and manipulation. The audacity of it, the way he thought he could just take from me to get what they wanted, was infuriating. I clenched my fists at my sides, trying to keep my temper under control, but it was getting harder by the second. You're unbelievable, I spat. You think you can just steal from me to buy a gift for someone I don't even care about? Go ahead, take it. But it's not going to change the fact that he's not my dad. He'll never be my dad, and you can't force me to pretend that he is. My half-sister, who had been silent up until that point, suddenly spoke up. We're too young to work, okay, she said, her voice quivering with the bitterness of defeat. He deserves something. He deserves a gift. Why can't you just give him something small? You don't have to like him, but he's the only dad we've known. He's done so much for all of us. I stood there, trying to digest what she said. She was too young to fully understand the weight of the situation, but the way she spoke made me feel like I was somehow the bad guy. They didn't understand that I couldn't just go along with their wishes, not when it felt like I was being forced to erase my own identity. He'll get nothing, I said flatly. And that's just too bad. So sad. I'm not going to play along with your little family games. He's not my dad. I don't want to be part of this anymore. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with the unspoken truth that none of us were willing to face. The tension crackled in the air, as if it were only a matter of time before someone exploded. And then, like a dam breaking, my half-brother shoved past me, trying to force his way into my room. But I was done. I was done with pretending, done with letting them push me around. I snapped. Get the fuck away from me. I shouted. My voice echoed through the house, sharp and unforgiving. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to play along with this bullshit anymore. I've had enough. I shoved past him, heading straight for the front door, my anger a whirlwind around me. I didn't care if they followed me, didn't care if they called me names or threatened me. All I knew was that I couldn't stay in that house anymore. I couldn't be around people who refused to respect my dad or my boundaries. I walked out into the cold night, breathing heavily, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. I didn't care if they were still shouting after me. My dad's house was the only place I felt like I mattered, the only place where I didn't have to pretend to be someone I wasn't. It wasn't until I got home to my dad that I realized just how much I had left behind in my wake. The door slammed behind me as I walked inside, and my dad, who had been reading in the living room, looked up in shock. He could tell something was wrong, the storm brewing in my eyes. Hey, what's going on? He asked, his voice steady and calm despite the chaos I had left behind. I told him everything, about the fight, the argument, how my siblings had tried to manipulate me into giving in, and how they threatened to steal from me. My dad listened without interruption, his face a mixture of concern and quiet understanding. When I finished, he didn't say much at first, but I could tell he was processing everything. You did the right thing, he said finally, his voice gentle but firm. You stood up for yourself. You didn't let them walk all over you. I'm proud of you for that. I wasn't sure if I believed him at the time, but hearing those words from my dad gave me a small sense of relief. I had made my choice, and now I had to live with the consequences. But at least I knew I wasn't alone in this battle. What would come next, though, was anyone's guess. My mom would find out about the fight eventually, and when she did, there would be hell to pay. The stakes were higher now, and I had no idea how this was going to play out. But one thing was certain, I wasn't backing down. I was done pretending that their dad was mine, done pretending that this messed up version of family could work. I knew who I was, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that from me. The fallout from my decision to leave my mom's house was swift and relentless. The tension that had been simmering for years finally erupted, leaving a wreckage of emotions, accusations, and tangled relationships. I knew the moment I walked out that door that I was crossing a line I could never uncross, but I didn't care. I was exhausted from the constant battle for respect and recognition, from the feeling of being suffocated in a home that tried to rewrite my reality. For once, I had chosen myself and my truth, even if it meant chaos would follow. When I got to my dad's house, the adrenaline that had fueled my escape began to fade, leaving a hollow exhaustion in its place. My dad's face was etched with concern as I stumbled through the door, still shaking with anger. He didn't bombard me with questions. Instead, he let me talk at my own pace, unraveling the events of the evening in between deep breaths and angry tears. I told him everything: how my half-siblings wouldn't leave me alone, how they tried to guilt me into buying a gift for their dad, and how I finally snapped under the weight of it all. My dad listened intently, his expression shifting between quiet fury and heartbreaking sadness. He didn't need to say much to make me feel validated. Just being in his presence, knowing he believed me and supported me, was enough to steady my fraying nerves. He assured me I wasn't in the wrong, that I had every right to stand up for myself, even if it came at a cost. But the peace didn't last long. The next day, my mom began her campaign to force me back into her house. She called me repeatedly, leaving angry voicemails that ranged from guilt trips to outright threats. When I didn't respond, she escalated the situation by involving the police. 2 officers showed up at my dad's door, asking me to come home. I told them plainly, not willingly. They couldn't force me to return, but their presence made it clear that my mom wasn't going to let this go. Her next move was to file in court, demanding that my dad lose custody for not making me return to her house. The absurdity of it all was almost laughable. She framed it as negligence on my dad's part, painting him as an enabler who allowed me to disrespect her and her husband. The narrative she spun was riddled with lies and half-truths, but I knew that didn't matter. Custody battles were rarely about truth, they were about who could present the most convincing case. The court battle loomed like a dark cloud, casting a shadow over everything. My dad and I prepared as best we could, gathering evidence to show that I was capable of making my own decisions and that my refusal to return to my mom's house wasn't a result of negligence or manipulation. Meanwhile, my mom doubled down on her efforts to vilify my dad, accusing him of turning me against her and fostering an environment of hostility. The emotional toll was immense. Everywhere I turned, it felt like someone was criticizing me for my actions. My mom's family, who had always been quick to side with her, bombarded me with messages about how ungrateful I was, how I was tearing the family apart. Even some of my friends struggled to understand why I wouldn't just make peace and go back. They couldn't grasp the depth of what I'd been through, the years of invalidation and erasure that had led to my breaking point. My half-siblings weren't any better. They called me repeatedly, leaving angry voicemails accusing me of being selfish and heartless. My half-brother, in particular, seemed determined to make me feel guilty, saying things like, "You've ruined everything. Dad deserves better than this." Their words stung, but I refused to let them sway me. I wasn't going to apologize for choosing my truth over their comfort. Through it all, my dad remained my anchor. He reminded me that I had every right to stand up for myself, even if it meant facing backlash. He told me stories about my childhood, about the times he had stayed up all night taking care of me when I was sick, about the milestones he had celebrated with me. He wanted me to remember, in the face of all the noise, that our bond was unbreakable, that no one could take away what we had built together. The court hearing was a nerve-wracking experience. My mom sat on one side of the room, her face a mask of righteous indignation. Her husband sat beside her, his expression smug and confident, as if he had already won. On our side, it was just me and my dad, a small but resolute team standing against the tide. When it was my turn to speak, I told the judge everything. I explained how I had been made to feel like an outsider in my mom's house, how my identity as my dad's son had been constantly undermined. I described the incident that led me to leave, the years of pent-up frustration that had finally boiled over. My voice shook at times, but I spoke with conviction, determined to make them understand why I couldn't go back. In the end, the judge ruled in our favor. My dad retained custody, and I was allowed to choose whether or not to spend time at my mom's house. The relief was overwhelming, but it was bittersweet. I knew the ruling wouldn't magically fix everything. My relationship with my mom and her family was fractured, perhaps beyond repair. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had control over my own life. The weeks that followed were a mix of healing and reflection. My dad and I worked on rebuilding a sense of normalcy, focusing on the things that brought us joy. We went hiking, cooked meals together, and had long conversations about everything and nothing. It wasn't always easy. There were moments when the weight of what had happened would creep back in, threatening to pull me under. But my dad was always there to remind me that I wasn't alone. As for my mom, things remained tense. She tried to reach out a few times, her tone oscillating between apologetic and accusatory. I kept my distance, unsure if I was ready to face her again. My half-siblings eventually stopped calling, though their silence was its own kind of wound. I missed them, despite everything, but I knew I couldn't compromise myself to mend those relationships. In the quiet moments, I thought about the road ahead. There would be more challenges, more moments of doubt and conflict. But I had learned something valuable through all of this. I was stronger than I had ever realized. I had stood up for myself, for my dad, for the truth of who I was. And no matter what came next, I knew I would face it with the same resolve. For the first time in years, I felt free. Free to be myself, free to embrace my identity without fear of judgment or erasure. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was mine. And that was enough.